The year was 1933, and the streets of Berlin hummed with a strange electricity, not the kind that powered the street lamps, but the kind that charged the air before a storm. In the universities and research institutes, a generation of scientists and engineers found themselves caught between ambition and ideology, between the promise of progress and the shadow of a regime that would use innovation as a weapon. Dr. Werner von Braun stood in a laboratory at the University of Berlin, his eyes fixed on a schematic that showed a rocket, not a small experimental device, but something grander, a machine that could pierce the sky itself. He was 21 years old, brilliant, and consumed by a dream that had nothing to do with politics and everything to do with reaching beyond the atmosphere. He did not yet understand that dreams, once harnessed by the state, become something else entirely. The Nazi regime recognized early that technology could be both symbol and sword. They invested heavily in projects that promised to demonstrate German superiority: rockets, jets, advanced tanks, synthetic fuels, and weapons that seemed pulled from the pages of science fiction. The propaganda machine spoke of Wunderwaffen, wonder weapons, that would turn the tide of any conflict and secure a 1,000-year Reich. But behind the propaganda lay a more complex reality, a network of scientists, many of whom were not ideologues but pragmatists, opportunists, or simply people trapped in a system that offered advancement in exchange for complicity. The Baltic coast town of Peenemünde became the heart of Germany's rocket program in 1937. Here, on a windswept peninsula where the sea met the sky in an endless grey dialogue, the Army Weapons Office established a research centre that would become one of the most advanced technological facilities in the world. Von Braun arrived with a team of engineers and physicists who shared his obsession with rocketry. They built test stands, workshops, and laboratories. They designed the A4 rocket, later known to the world as the V2, Vergeltungswaffe 2, or Vengeance Weapon 2. It stood 14 meters tall, weighed over 12 tons, and could carry a 1-ton warhead over 300 kilometers at supersonic speeds. The first successful test came on October 3, 1942. The rocket climbed into the stratosphere, reaching an altitude of 84.5 kilometers before arcing back to Earth. In the control room, the engineers erupted in celebration. Von Braun reportedly said, "The rocket worked perfectly, except for landing on the wrong planet." It was meant as a joke about Mars, but it carried an uncomfortable truth. This technology was designed not for exploration, but for destruction. The human cost of the V2 program remains one of its darkest chapters. The rockets were manufactured in underground factories, most notably the Mittelbau-Dora concentration camp complex near Nordhausen. Prisoners, Jews, political dissidents, Soviet POWs were forced to work in horrific conditions, tunneling into mountains and assembling rockets in freezing, lightless caverns. More people died building the V2 than were killed by the weapon itself. Approximately 20,000 slave laborers perished from exhaustion, starvation, and brutality, while the rockets killed an estimated 9,000 civilians and military personnel, primarily in London and Antwerp. Von Braun visited Mittelbau-Dora. He saw the conditions. After the war, he would claim ignorance of the full extent of the suffering, but documents and testimony suggest he was aware that slave labor powered his dream. This is the terrible arithmetic of technology under totalitarianism. Innovation built on graves, progress measured in human misery. While rockets reached for the sky, another revolution was unfolding in the realm of aviation. The Messerschmitt Me 262, the world's first operational jet-powered fighter aircraft, represented a quantum leap in aerial warfare. Powered by twin Junkers Jumo 004 turbojet engines, it could reach speeds of 870 km/h, far faster than any Allied propeller-driven fighter. The Me 262's development was led by a team of engineers who understood they were creating something unprecedented. The jet engine itself had been developed independently by Hans von Ohain in Germany and Frank Whittle in Britain, but the Germans were first to put it into combat service. The first prototype flew in 1942, but production delays, material shortages and, critically, Adolf Hitler's interference prevented the Me-262 from reaching its full potential. Hitler insisted the aircraft be modified as a bomber rather than a fighter, a decision that delayed deployment and squandered its advantages. By the time significant numbers reached combat units in 1944, it was too late to affect the war's outcome. Pilots who flew the Me-262 spoke of it with a mixture of awe and frustration. It was fast, powerful, and could outclimb any Allied aircraft, but it was also mechanically unreliable. The engines had short lifespans, and it required long runways that made it vulnerable during takeoff and landing. Allied pilots learned to attack Me-262s at their most vulnerable moments, and the technological advantage was often neutralized by tactical awareness. Franz Stegler, a Luftwaffe pilot who flew the Me-262, later reflected, "We had the future in our hands, but we were flying for a past that was already dead. Every mission felt like borrowing time from a world that no longer existed." Technology was not only about rockets and jets. One of the most significant and least visible theaters of innovation was cryptography. The Enigma machine, an electromechanical cipher device, was used by the German military to encrypt communications. It was complex, elegant, and, the Germans believed, unbreakable. The Enigma resembled a typewriter housed in a wooden box, but its internal mechanism was far more sophisticated. It used rotors that scrambled letters through billions of possible combinations, creating codes that changed with each keystroke. Messages were transmitted via Morse code, and recipients used identically configured Enigma machines to decrypt them. What the Germans did not know, or refused to believe even when evidence suggested otherwise, was that Polish mathematicians had begun breaking Enigma codes before the war, and that British cryptanalysts at Bletchley Park, led by figures like Alan Turing and Gordon Welchman, had developed methods and machines, the bomb, to systematically decode German messages. The intelligence gained from decrypted Enigma messages, codenamed Ultra, gave the Allies critical advantages. They could anticipate U-boat positions, understand German troop movements, and counter strategic plans. The impact was immeasurable. Some historians estimate Ultra shortened the war in Europe by 2 years and saved countless lives. The Germans continually upgraded Enigma, adding rotors and complexity, but they failed to grasp that the fundamental architecture was vulnerable to mathematical attack. Their confidence in technology became a weakness, a reminder that innovation without critical assessment can become a liability. Germany's lack of natural oil reserves drove one of the most ambitious technological programs of the era, synthetic fuel production. The Fischer-Tropsch process, developed in the 1920s, converted coal into liquid hydrocarbons, gasoline, diesel, and lubricants. By 1944, synthetic plants provided nearly 90% of Germany's aviation fuel and half of its total petroleum needs. These facilities, often enormous industrial complexes like the one at Lohna, represented a triumph of chemical engineering. They kept tanks rolling and aircraft flying when conventional oil supplies were cut off by Allied blockades. But they also became prime targets. Allied bombers pounded synthetic fuel plants relentlessly in 1944 and 1945. The loss of these facilities crippled German military operations more effectively than many battlefield victories. By early 1945, the Luftwaffe was grounded not by lack of aircraft or pilots, but by lack of fuel. The story of synthetic fuel illustrates a paradox. Technology can provide solutions to strategic vulnerabilities, but those solutions create new vulnerabilities. The centralized industrial nature of synthetic fuel production made it fragile under sustained attack. Among the lesser-known technological pursuits was the development of infrared night vision devices. The Germans created systems like the Vampire for the STG-44 assault rifle, allowing soldiers to see in complete darkness using infrared light invisible to the naked eye. The system consisted of an infrared spotlight mounted on the rifle and a viewer worn on the soldier's head. It was bulky, the batteries lasted only a few hours, and the effective range was limited to about 100 meters. But it worked. German units equipped with Vampire devices conducted successful night ambushes on the Eastern Front in the war's final months. This technology foreshadowed the night vision systems that would become standard in modern militaries, but in 1945 it was too little, too late. The war was already lost, and these devices became curiosities, artifacts of what might have been had Germany possessed more time, more resources, or different leadership. The U-boat campaign represented both technological sophistication and strategic desperation. German submarines, particularly the Type 7 and Type 9 classes, were among the most effective weapons of the war, sinking millions of tons of Allied shipping in the Battle of the Atlantic. As Allied anti-submarine warfare improved, through radar, sonar, depth charges, and long-range aircraft, the U-boats faced mounting losses. The Germans responded with innovations like the snorkel, Schnorchel, a retractable tube that allowed submarines to run diesel engines while submerged, drawing in air and expelling exhaust. The snorkel dramatically increased underwater endurance, reducing the need to surface and making U-boats harder to detect. By 1944, most operational U-boats were equipped with snorkels, and they remained a threat until the war's end. The most advanced submarines were the Type 21 electro-boot models, designed for sustained high-speed underwater travel using improved battery systems. They featured streamlined hulls, hydraulic torpedo loading, and advanced sonar. Only a handful became operational before Germany's surrender, but they influenced submarine design for decades. Both the United States and Soviet Union studied captured Type 21s extensively. Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of the U-boat fleet, believed these innovations could turn the tide. They couldn't. Technology alone cannot overcome overwhelming material superiority and strategic defeat. Part 8. The Ethics of the Engineers. After the war, many of the scientists and engineers who had served the Nazi regime faced a moral reckoning. Some were tried for war crimes, particularly those directly involved in slave labor programs. Others, like von Braun and his rocket team, were recruited by the victors, the United States and Soviet Union, in operations like Paperclip and Ossoaviakhim. Von Braun became a central figure in America's space program, eventually leading the team that developed the Saturn V rocket, which carried astronauts to the moon. He was lionized as a visionary, but the shadow of Peenemünde and Mittelbau-Dora never entirely left him. Critics asked, can a man responsible for weapons built by slaves be celebrated as a hero of exploration? The question has no easy answer. Von Braun himself offered varying accounts over the years, sometimes claiming ignorance, sometimes expressing regret, but never fully confronting the depth of his complicity. He was a complicated figure, a brilliant engineer whose dreams required accommodation with evil, a man who reached the stars while standing on graves. This tension between the purity of scientific ambition and the corruption of its application defines much of the Nazi technological legacy. Part 9. The Myth of the Wunderwaffe. The Nazi regime promoted the idea that secret superweapons would secure victory even as conventional forces crumbled. This mythology persists in popular culture. Stories of flying saucers, death rays, atomic bombs, and other fantastical devices. The reality was more prosaic. While Germany pursued advanced projects, including early research into nuclear fission, most wonder weapons were either impractical, arrived too late, or existed only on paper. The regime's propaganda machine amplified rumors to sustain morale and terrify enemies, but propaganda cannot replace tanks, fuel, and soldiers. Some projects, like the Horton Ho 229 Flying Wing or the Landkreuzer P-1000 Ratte, a proposed 1,000-ton tank, never moved beyond prototypes or design sketches. They consumed resources better spent on proven systems. The lesson is clear. Innovation without strategic coherence is waste. Technology is a tool, not a talisman, and its effectiveness depends on integration with broader military, economic, and political realities. Part X: Legacy and Reflection. The technological achievements of Nazi Germany cannot be separated from the context in which they were created. They emerged from a regime built on conquest, genocide, and the systematic exploitation of millions. Every rocket, every jet, every cipher machine carries this history. In the decades since 1945, the world has grappled with this legacy. We use technologies pioneered or advanced during the Nazi era, jets, rockets, computers, but we must remember the cost at which they were developed. The scientists and engineers who created them were not mythical figures of pure genius or pure evil. They were human beings who made choices, some brave, some cowardly, many ambiguous. The story of Nazi technology is ultimately a story about the relationship between knowledge and power, between ambition and ethics, between the future we dream of and the past we cannot escape. It reminds us that progress is not inevitable, that innovation can serve both liberation and oppression, and that the responsibilities of those who create powerful tools extend far beyond the laboratory. In the depths of the Atlantic, where sunlight fades to black and pressure crushes steel, a different kind of technological race unfolded. The German Zaunkönig torpedo, designated T5 and known to the Allies as the Gnat, German Navy acoustic torpedo, represented a breakthrough in naval warfare, a weapon that could hunt its target by sound. Developed at the Torpedo Experimental Establishment in Eckernförde, the acoustic torpedo was designed to counter the convoy escort vessels that had become increasingly effective at destroying U-boats. Traditional torpedoes required precise aim and timing. The T5 used passive acoustic homing to detect the propeller noise of ships and adjust its course automatically. The physics were elegant. Hydrophones in the torpedo's nose picked up the cavitation sounds, the churning, bubbling noise produced by a ship's propellers. An analog computer processed these signals and sent steering commands to the torpedo's rudder. Once launched, it would circle in a search pattern until it detected a target, then pursue it relentlessly. The first operational use came in September 1943. U-boats equipped with acoustic torpedoes achieved notable successes, sinking several destroyers and corvettes. Allied naval crews reported a terrifying new reality. Evasive maneuvers no longer guaranteed safety. The hunter had become the hunted. But the Allies adapted quickly. They developed the Foxer, a noise-making device towed behind ships that produced louder propeller sounds than the ship itself, decoying the acoustic torpedoes away from their intended targets. Later versions, like the American Cat, counter-acoustic torpedo gear, proved even more effective. By mid-1944, the acoustic torpedo's advantage had largely evaporated. The Germans responded with improved models, the T-10 and T-11, but these arrived too late and in insufficient numbers. The cycle repeated: innovation, adaptation, counter-innovation, technology as conversation, conducted in the language of survival. Professor Helmuth Walter possessed a vision that bordered on obsession. Submarines that could travel underwater at speeds matching surface vessels. His solution was radical: propulsion systems powered by high-test peroxide, HTP, a highly concentrated form of hydrogen peroxide that could decompose explosively to produce oxygen and superheated steam. The Walter turbine used this chemical reaction to drive a steam turbine without requiring external air, allowing true underwater propulsion independent of batteries or diesel engines. In theory, a Walter U-boat could reach underwater speeds of 25 knots or more, revolutionary compared to the 7-8 knots of conventional submarines. Several experimental vessels were built, including the Type 17 U-boats. Trials showed the system worked. U-107, a Type 17B, achieved 25 knots submerged during tests in 1944. The acceleration was extraordinary. Crews reported being thrown against bulkheads when the turbine engaged at full power. But the Walter system had severe limitations. Hydrogen peroxide, at the required concentration, over 80%, was incredibly dangerous, corrosive, explosive, and difficult to manufacture and store. The fuel consumption was enormous. Operational range was measured in hours rather than days. Any leak or contamination could trigger catastrophic decomposition. Only a handful of Walter boats were completed before war's end, and none saw combat. Yet the concept influenced post-war submarine development. Both Britain and the Soviet Union experimented with hydrogen peroxide propulsion in the 1950s, before concluding that nuclear power offered a safer, more practical solution for high-speed underwater travel. Walter himself was a pure technologist, fascinated by problems of thrust and efficiency, seemingly disconnected from the military applications. After the war, he worked briefly for the British before retiring to obscurity. His turbines remained a footnote, brilliant in conception, impractical in execution, a reminder that not every innovation deserves implementation. On September 9, 1943, the Italian battleship Roma was steaming toward Allied-controlled ports following Italy's armistice with the Allies. German aircraft appeared overhead and released weapons that looked like conventional bombs until they didn't. The bombs maneuvered in flight, adjusting course, tracking the ship below. These were Fritz X guided bombs, among the world's first precision-guided munitions. Developed by Max Kramer at the German research establishment DVL, the Fritz X was a 400-kilogram armor-piercing bomb with 4 stub wings and a tail assembly containing radio-controlled spoilers. A bombardier in the launching aircraft tracked the bomb visually and transmitted steering commands via radio link. The Roma took 2 direct hits. One penetrated the forward magazine, triggering a massive explosion that broke the ship in half. It sank within minutes, taking 1,393 men with it, the largest loss of life from a single guided weapon attack in naval history. The Fritz X and its counterpart, the Henschel HS-293, a rocket-boosted glide bomb designed for use against ships, represented a conceptual leap, weapons that could be aimed after release, dramatically increasing accuracy. In the hands of skilled operators, they were devastatingly effective. Allied ships in the Mediterranean learned to fear the distinctive silhouette of Do-217 and He-177 bombers carrying these weapons. Several ships were sunk or damaged, including the British battleship HMS Warspite and the American cruiser USS Savannah. Countermeasures emerged. Radio jamming systems disrupted the guidance signals, while increased anti-aircraft fire forced the launching aircraft to release from higher altitudes, reducing accuracy. The Germans attempted to develop wire-guided versions immune to jamming, but production difficulties and Allied air superiority limited their deployment. Today's precision-guided munitions, laser-guided bombs, GPS-guided weapons, cruise missiles are direct descendants of these early experiments. The Fritz X and HS-293 established a principle that would define modern warfare: the ability to hit exactly what you aim at, from a distance, with minimal collateral damage. The irony is bitter. A technology pioneered by a regime that practiced indiscriminate mass murder became the foundation for weapon systems designed, in theory, to minimize civilian casualties. The image of German tanks rolling across Europe is iconic, but the technological reality was more nuanced than popular imagination suggests. Early German tanks, the Panzer I and II, were training vehicles pressed into combat service, lightly armed and armoured. The Panzer III and I-4 were solid, reliable designs that formed the backbone of panzer divisions, but they were not technologically superior to Allied counterparts. The game changed with the introduction of heavier designs. The Panther, Panzer IV, emerged in response to encountering the Soviet T-34 on the Eastern Front. The T-34's combination of sloped armor, wide tracks for mobility, and powerful 76mm gun shocked German planners who had assumed technological superiority. The Panther incorporated lessons learned: sloped frontal armor up to 80mm thick, a high-velocity 75mm gun, and improved suspension. At its best, it was arguably the finest medium tank of the war, fast, well-armed, and well-protected. But it was also mechanically complex, prone to transmission failures, and expensive to produce. The Tiger I and Tiger II, King Tiger, took a different approach. Massive, heavily armored and armed, virtually immune to most Allied tank guns at combat ranges. The Tiger I's 80mm gun, derived from the legendary Flak 88 anti-aircraft gun, could destroy any Allied tank in service when the Tiger debuted in 1942. But these advantages came at enormous cost. The Tiger weighed 57 tons, the King Tiger 70 tons. They consumed fuel voraciously, broke down frequently, and were difficult to transport and maintain. Germany produced only about 350 Tigers of both types combined, compared to over 50,000 American Sherman tanks. The most telling innovation was not in individual tank design, but in combined arms doctrine. German panzer divisions integrated tanks, motorized infantry, artillery, engineers, and air support into cohesive units capable of rapid, coordinated action, the Blitzkrieg concept. This organizational innovation proved more significant than any single vehicle. By 1944-45, desperation produced increasingly impractical designs. The Maus, a 188-ton behemoth that was too heavy for most bridges and roads. The Jagdtiger, an enormous tank destroyer that broke down more often than it fought. These white elephants consumed resources that could have been spent on proven designs, or more significantly, on fuel and trained crews. The lesson of German tank development is clear. Technological sophistication cannot compensate for strategic overreach and resource limitations. Better to field adequate equipment in sufficient quantity than to pursue perfection you cannot afford. In the rethinking of infantry armament, the Sturmgewehr 44, STG 44, literally Assault Rifle 44, was the world's first practical assault rifle, a weapon category that would dominate military thinking for the next 80 years. Traditional military doctrine divided infantry weapons into rifles, long-range, powerful, slow-firing, and submachine guns, short-range, less powerful, rapid-firing. The STG-44 occupied the middle ground: selective fire capability, an intermediate cartridge, the 7.92 33mm Kurz, effective range of 300 meters, and a 30-round detachable magazine. The design emerged from observations on the Eastern Front. Analysis showed that most infantry combat occurred at ranges under 300 meters, making the full-power rifle cartridges like the 7.92 57mm Mauser excessive. Soldiers rarely used their rifles' theoretical 800-plus meter range. Meanwhile, submachine guns lacked effective range and stopping power. Hugo Schmeiser and his team at C.G. Haenel created a weapon optimized for actual combat conditions rather than peacetime theory. The intermediate cartridge reduced recoil, allowing controllable automatic fire. The design was simple, reliable, and could be manufactured with stamped metal parts rather than precision machining, critical as skilled labor became scarce. Hitler initially opposed the project, demanding continued production of traditional rifles, but field commanders and soldiers enthusiastically adopted the new weapon. It was eventually produced under various designations to circumvent Hitler's objections before receiving official recognition. Approximately 425,000 STG-44s were produced before war's end. Not enough to re-equip the entire army, but sufficient to demonstrate the concept's viability. After the war, the design directly influenced the Soviet AK-47 and, less directly, every military rifle that followed. The STG-44 represents a rare example of Nazi technological development, driven primarily by practical military needs rather than propaganda or ideological considerations. It succeeded because it solved a real problem elegantly and efficiently. In a laboratory in Leverkusen in 1936, chemist Gerhard Schrader was attempting to develop more effective insecticides when he synthesized a compound designated Le-100. Within minutes of exposure, he and his assistant experienced severe symptoms: dimming vision, constricted pupils, difficulty breathing. They had discovered tabun, the first nerve agent. Nerve agents, organophosphates that inhibit the enzyme acetylcholinesterase, are among the most toxic substances ever created. Tabun was followed by sarin, 1938, and soman, 1944, each progressively more lethal. These substances disrupt the nervous system, causing convulsions, paralysis, and death through respiratory failure. Exposure to minute quantities, milligrams, can be fatal. The Nazi government immediately classified the research and mandated production. By 1945, Germany had stockpiled approximately 12,000 tons of tabun, along with smaller quantities of sarin. Artillery shells and bombs were filled with these agents, ready for deployment. The question that haunts history is, why were they never used? Several factors likely contributed. German chemical warfare capabilities, while advanced, were not unique. The Allies also possessed chemical weapons and had made clear they would retaliate in kind. Hitler himself had been temporarily blinded by mustard gas in World War I and reportedly harbored a personal aversion to chemical warfare. Logistical considerations also played a role. By the time Germany faced existential threat, the infrastructure and air superiority needed for effective chemical weapon deployment had been destroyed. Additionally, German intelligence significantly overestimated Allied chemical warfare capabilities, believing, incorrectly, that the Allies possessed nerve agents of their own. The fear of retaliation may have served as an effective deterrent. After the war, Allied teams discovered the stockpiles and were shocked by both the quantity and potency. Samples were analyzed and the formulas reverse-engineered, leading to a new generation of chemical weapons programs during the Cold War. The nerve agents developed by Nazi chemists became templates for VX, Novichok, and other modern agents. Schrader himself claimed he had no desire to create weapons and was horrified by the military application of his research. Whether this represents genuine regret or post-war rationalization is debatable. What is clear is that his discovery opened a door that cannot be closed. The knowledge exists, and the temptation to weaponize chemistry persists. The nerve agent story underscores a troubling truth about technological development. Knowledge generated for one purpose can be perverted to another, and the scientist who makes a discovery may have little control over its ultimate application. Intent and outcome rarely align in the realm of dual-use technologies. The darkness had always been an ally to those who sought to hide, but German engineers worked to eliminate this advantage. Beyond the vampire system mentioned earlier, research extended into more sophisticated infrared technologies that would shape military capabilities for decades. The most ambitious project was the development of infrared search and detection equipment for tanks. The Panther AUSFF was planned to receive the Sperber infrared device, which consisted of a 30 cm infrared searchlight and an image converter operated by the tank commander. The system could detect targets at ranges up to 600 meters in complete darkness. A small number of Panthers were equipped with Sperber FG-1250 systems and saw limited action in 1945. Crews reported mixed results. The system worked as designed, providing significant tactical advantage in night operations, but the bulky equipment was vulnerable to damage, required substantial battery power, and the infrared searchlight, while invisible to the naked eye, could be detected by Allied forces equipped with infrared detection gear. The Kriegsmarine also developed infrared binoculars for U-boat bridge watch personnel, allowing them to scan for Allied aircraft and ships at night without revealing their position with visible light. These devices used image converter tubes, early electronic image intensifiers, that transformed infrared light into visible images. The technology was revolutionary but immature. Image quality was poor, resolution low, and the equipment fragile and expensive. Yet the fundamental principle, amplifying available light or using active infrared illumination to see in darkness, would evolve into the night vision systems that became standard in modern militaries. In the murky waters of the English Channel and North Sea, a new form of naval mine emerged that required no physical contact to detonate. The magnetic influence mine, dropped by aircraft or laid by submarines, rested on the seabed and waited. When a ship passed overhead, the mine's magnetic sensor detected the distortion in Earth's magnetic field caused by the vessel's steel hull and triggered detonation. The weapon was devastatingly effective when first deployed in 1939. Traditional mine-sweeping methods, dragging cables or nets to snag tethered mines, were useless against weapons that sat on the bottom and required no physical contact. British shipping suffered severe losses in the early months of the war. The breakthrough came when a German mine was recovered intact from mudflats at Shoeburyness in November 1939. British scientists and engineers reverse-engineered the firing mechanism and developed countermeasures. The most effective was degaussing, passing electrical current through cables wrapped around a ship's hull to create a magnetic field that cancelled out the ship's magnetic signature. Within months, the threat was substantially mitigated. Ships were degaussed. New acoustic and pressure-activated mines emerged in a technological back and forth that continued throughout the war. The Germans developed more sophisticated multi-influence mines that required specific combinations of magnetic, acoustic, and pressure signatures before detonating, making them harder to sweep. Mine warfare represented a domain where technological innovation occurred in cycles measured in months rather than years. Each advance prompted a counter-advance. Each solution created a new problem. The competition was less about singular breakthroughs than persistent, incremental improvement and adaptation. Long before GPS, before radar-guided bombing, German engineers developed radio navigation systems that allowed aircraft to find targets in darkness and bad weather with unprecedented accuracy. The most sophisticated was the Knickebein, crooked leg system, followed by the more advanced X-Girate and Y-Girate systems. These systems worked by transmitting narrow radio beams from ground stations. A bomber equipped with the appropriate receiver would fly along one beam until it intersected a second beam, indicating the exact moment to release bombs. The system was accurate to within a few hundred meters, from ranges of several hundred kilometers, revolutionary for the era. The Luftwaffe used these systems during the Blitz, targeting British cities with far greater precision than visual navigation alone would permit. The British initially dismissed reports of the systems as impossible. The prevailing understanding of radio propagation suggested such narrow beams couldn't be maintained over long distances. Dr. R.V. Jones of British Scientific Intelligence proved otherwise. He identified the system, located the transmitter stations, and developed countermeasures. British transmitters broadcast false signals on the same frequencies, bending the beams away from intended targets or creating false intersections. Bombers following the doctored beams dropped their payloads on open countryside. The Battle of the Beams, as Jones later called it, exemplified electronic warfare, invisible, technical, conducted by specialists rather than soldiers, yet with life and death consequences for civilians below. It was warfare as mathematics, as signal processing, as a contest of minds rather than muscle. The Germans continued to develop more sophisticated systems, attempting frequency hopping, encryption, and other countermeasures, but never regained the advantage. British electronic warfare capabilities matured rapidly, and by 1941, the beam systems were largely neutralized. As I compile this chronicle of Nazi technological development, certain patterns emerge that transcend individual weapons and systems. The Nazi regime achieved undeniable technical innovations, but these innovations were almost universally. 1. Driven by aggressive war aims, technologies were developed to conquer, occupy, and extract resources from other nations. 2. Built on exploitation, slave labor, confiscated resources, and occupied territories' industrial capacity powered much of the technological effort. 3. Strategically misapplied, even effective technologies were often deployed inefficiently due to ideological interference, poor strategic planning, and the regime's increasingly desperate circumstances. 4. Too late or too little, many innovations arrived when Germany no longer had the resources, industrial capacity, or strategic position to exploit them effectively. 5. Ultimately futile. No amount of technological sophistication could overcome the fundamental strategic errors, moral bankruptcy, and material disadvantages that doomed the Nazi war effort. The human cost of these technologies, both in their development and deployment, remains the central tragedy. Prisoners died building V-2 rockets. Civilians died under guided bombs. Soldiers on all sides died from weapons designed with clinical efficiency to kill. The scientists and engineers who created these systems made choices. Some believed in the ideology, some sought career advancement, some convinced themselves they were merely solving technical problems divorced from moral consequences. After 1945, the world inherited this technology. The rockets became space programs. The jets became civilian airliners and military aircraft. The computing and cryptographic advances became the foundation of information technology. The nerve agents became deterrents and occasionally tools of assassination and terror. We cannot undo this inheritance. We can only acknowledge it, understand it, and commit to, ensuring that technological development serves human dignity rather than its destruction. The story of Nazi technology is ultimately a story about choices. Choices made by scientists, engineers, political leaders, and ordinary people who decided to participate, resist, or look away. The machines they built have rusted or evolved into new forms. The knowledge they generated persists in textbooks, patents, and the minds of subsequent generations. The moral questions remain as urgent today as they were in 1945. What responsibilities do creators bear for their creations? When does innovation become complicity? How do we pursue knowledge without serving evil? These questions have no simple answers, which is precisely why we must continue asking them. End of extended chronicle. This concludes the comprehensive examination of Nazi technological developments. The story encompasses innovation and horror, brilliance and brutality, human ingenuity and moral failure. A reminder that technology is never neutral and progress always carries a price.